Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The air here is thick with the scent of river mud and incense, the kind that clings to the back of your throat in the most ancient of Sumerian temples, somewhere around 3500 BCE in the land between two rivers, where civilization itself supposedly learned to write its name. You're standing now in the cool darkness of a ziggurat's inner chamber, and honestly, you probably won't survive this, not because of any physical danger, but because the sheer weight of 5,000 years of historical debate might just put you into the deepest sleep you've ever experienced, which is after all exactly what we're hoping for tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something wonderfully communal about knowing we're all drifting off together across different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to explore the Anunnaki, those mysterious beings whose very mention splits historians into camps, more divided than a Mesopotamian city-state during drought season. The mainstream archaeological record tells us something quite concrete, and honestly rather beautiful. The Sumerians developed the world's first true writing system, cuneiform, around 3400 BCE, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets that would harden into permanent records of grain transactions, temple inventories, and yes, stories of their gods, the Anunnaki, which in Sumerian translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, though some scholars prefer the more modest offspring of Anu, their sky god, which sounds considerably less like a science fiction premise and more like a regular old pantheon of deities doing regular old deity things. The word itself appears in countless tablets, sometimes numbering the Anunnaki at 50, sometimes at 700, depending on which ancient accountant you ask, and whether they were having a good day with their stylus. Archaeological evidence from sites like Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever built, shows temple construction dating back to 5400 BCE, though the writing that would immortalize the Anunnaki stories doesn't appear until much later, which creates this fascinating gap where we know people were worshipping something, but we have no idea exactly what stories they were telling about those somethings. Now here's where things get deliciously weird, because the fringe interpretation camp, and you knew we'd get here eventually, suggests that the Anunnaki weren't gods at all, but actual extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth roughly 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they apparently needed to save their home planet's atmosphere, a theory popularized in the 1970s by Zecharia Sitchin, who reinterpreted ancient texts with the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered you could read between the lines if you squinted hard enough and ignored most of conventional linguistics. Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their DNA with that of Homo erectus, essentially creating humans as a worker species to do the mining, which would make us all the product of the universe's most elaborate labor shortage solution, and frankly, explains a lot about Monday mornings if you think about it too hard. According to this interpretation, Sumerian texts aren't mythology at all, but actual historical records of alien intervention, with the gods being misunderstood advanced technology, the flying vehicles, the sophisticated weapons, the ability to create life, all of it supposedly described in the tablets, if you just read them with the right pair of ancient astronaut-tinted glasses. The scholarly debate here is intense enough to fuel 1,000 academic conferences, with most Assyriologists, the actual experts who spend their lives reading cuneiform, firmly rejecting the ancient astronaut interpretation on grounds that it fundamentally misunderstands how Sumerian language works, how mythology functions in ancient societies, and how translation itself operates, but also because many of Sitchin's translations have been demonstrated to be, let's say charitably, creative at best, and completely fabricated at worst. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages who passed away in 2023, spent considerable effort systematically dismantling these alternative translations, pointing out that Sitchin didn't actually read Sumerian very well and made claims about the texts that simply aren't supported by what the tablets actually say when you read them with proper linguistic training. The mainstream view holds that the Anunnaki were divine beings in the Sumerian pantheon, children of An, the sky god, who judged the souls of the dead, and were associated with the earth and the underworld in various capacities, depending on which text you're reading, and which city-state was doing the writing. because ancient Mesopotamia was nothing if not religiously diverse, with each city having its favorite deities and particular interpretations. But here's what makes this genuinely fascinating from a historical standpoint. The Sumerians really did believe that kingship itself descended from heaven, that their rulers were chosen by the gods, and that civilization was a divine gift rather than a human achievement, which tells us something profound about how they understood their place in the universe. The famous Sumerian king list, which we'll get to more deeply in Section 3, begins with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu," suggesting that before the flood, yes, the Sumerians had a flood story that predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years. Kings ruled for impossibly long periods, sometimes tens of thousands of years, which is either evidence of extraterrestrial lifespans or, more likely, a mythological way of expressing the deep antiquity and divine legitimacy of their political institutions. The temple complex at Eridu, where this story locates the beginning of civilization, sits on top of 17 successive building layers, each temple built on the ruins of the previous one, dating back into the Ubaid period around 5400 BCE, which means people were worshipping at this spot for nearly 2,000 years before writing even existed to tell us what they believed. Archaeological excavations in the 1940s and 1950s by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and his team revealed that the earliest shrine at Eridu was a small mud brick structure with a central altar and offering table, the prototype for all later Mesopotamian temples, and it's genuinely moving to imagine generation after generation rebuilding the same sacred space, each time a little larger, a little more elaborate, maintaining a tradition across centuries before anyone could write down why they were doing it. The Anunnaki themselves appear in various roles across Sumerian literature, sometimes as judges in the underworld, sometimes as the gods who maintained the cosmic order called the Me, sometimes as the divine council that made decisions about human affairs, and their exact nature and number shifts depending on context, which is typical of polytheistic systems where divine relationships are complex and functions overlap. The goddess Inanna, for instance, who becomes Ishtar in later Akkadian tradition, is sometimes counted among the Anunnaki, sometimes distinguished from them, and her famous descent to the underworld involves facing the Anunnaki as judges, stripped of her divine powers with each gate she passes through, which you have to admit is a pretty intense story about the limits of even divine power when you enter someone else's domain. But let's circle back to the clay tablets themselves, because there's something almost meditative about imagining a scribe in the early dawn light of a Sumerian morning, sitting cross-legged in a temple courtyard, carefully pressing his reed stylus into a fresh clay tablet, recording not just grain amounts or legal contracts, but the names of gods, the deeds of heroes, the structure of the cosmos as his people understood it. Each tablet had to be completed before the clay dried, which gave scribes maybe an hour or two to finish their work, and mistakes couldn't be erased, only noted and corrected in subsequent copies, which means every surviving tablet represents both a moment of careful concentration and an acceptance of imperfection. A very human document despite its divine subject matter. The process of becoming a scribe took years of training in specialized schools called edubas, where young students, always boys, as far as we can tell, practiced writing the same signs over and over, learned the standard texts, memorized multiplication tables and legal formulas, and absorbed the entire intellectual tradition of their civilization, including all the stories about the Anunnaki and their interactions with humanity. We have surviving homework tablets where students practiced writing, complete with teacher corrections, and they're simultaneously hilarious and touching. One tablet shows a student complaint about his teacher hitting him for talking in class. Another records a father bribing a teacher with expensive gifts to pay more attention to his son, proving that some aspects of education are truly timeless, even if the subject matter was rather different. The main historical fact we need to anchor ourselves to, amid all the interpretation and speculation, is this: the Sumerians genuinely believed in a complex divine hierarchy, with the Anunnaki playing crucial roles. They recorded these beliefs in the world's earliest writing system, and these records influenced every subsequent culture in the ancient Near East, from the Akkadians to the Babylonians to the Assyrians, creating a religious continuity that lasted thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is often cited in Anunnaki discussions, mentions these divine beings and their role in human affairs, particularly in the flood story, where the god Ea warns the hero Utnapishtim about the coming deluge, saving humanity and animals in an ark, a tale that clearly influenced the later biblical flood narrative and demonstrates how stories migrate across cultures and time. What's particularly interesting about the Anunnaki in context is that they represent a transition in Mesopotamian religious thought. In the earliest periods, They seemed to be more important, more actively involved in human affairs. But by the time of the Babylonian Empire, around 1800 BCE, gods like Marduk and individual city deities have become more prominent in the texts, with the Anunnaki relegated to more background roles as judges and cosmic administrators rather than active players in human drama. This shift might reflect changing political realities, as Mesopotamian civilization evolved from independent city-states to larger territorial empires requiring different theological justification for centralized power, or it might simply reflect the natural evolution of religious ideas over centuries, the way any belief system changes as new generations reinterpret old symbols. The fringe theorists, of course, interpret this shift as evidence that the actual aliens left or became less involved in human affairs, which is one way to read it if you're already committed to that framework, though it requires ignoring basically all of comparative mythology and religious studies. The scholarly consensus view, tedious but probably correct, is that the Anunnaki represent a fundamental aspect of how ancient Mesopotamians conceived of divine power, not as individual gods with distinct personalities like the Greek pantheon, but more as a category of divine beings, a collective noun for the group of gods who maintained cosmic order and judged human actions, their exact identities and numbers, less important than their function in the religious worldview. There's something almost drowsy in contemplating these distinctions, isn't there? The way ancient peoples categorized their spiritual universe with such care, creating taxonomies of the divine, as complex as any modern scientific classification system. The clay tablets themselves, thousands of them, rest now in museums around the world. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, each one a small miracle of preservation, baked hard by ancient fires or by the fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them, inadvertently preserving them for millennia. Reading them requires specialized knowledge because cuneiform isn't a straightforward alphabet, but a complex system combining logograms, syllabic signs, and determinatives that indicate semantic categories, meaning the same sign can represent different sounds or concepts depending on context, which is why proper translation is actually quite difficult, and why amateur enthusiasts like Sitchin often get it spectacularly wrong. Professional Assyriologists spend years learning not just Sumerian, but also Akkadian, Hittite, and other ancient languages to understand the full context of any given text, and even then, debates rage about specific interpretations, because ancient languages are by their nature incomplete puzzles with missing pieces and ambiguous grammar. But here in this temple chamber, breathing in the smoke of cedar incense that was expensive even 5,000 years ago, imported from distant Lebanon, feeling the cool of sun-baked brick walls that hold the day's heat until long after sunset, we can perhaps imagine how a Sumerian priest might have understood the Anunnaki, not as aliens or as mere metaphors, but as real powerful beings who shaped reality itself, whose will determined whether the harvest succeeded, whether the rivers flooded beneficially or destructively, whether the king ruled wisely or fell into chaos. The psychological reality of that belief was absolute, shaping every decision, every prayer, every offering left at the temple altar, and in that sense, the Anunnaki were real because an entire civilization believed them to be real and structured their society around that belief. The first cities rise from the marshy plains of southern Mesopotamia like miracles of human organization, each one centered on its temple, its ziggurat reaching toward the heavens where the gods supposedly dwell. And if you could hover over this landscape around 3000 BCE, you would see a constellation of urban centers: Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, connected by irrigation canals and trade routes, glowing with torchlight after sunset, the smoke of countless cooking fires and temple offerings rising into the evening sky. These cities represent something genuinely revolutionary in human history, the first time our species successfully organized itself into complex, stratified societies with specialized labor, bureaucratic administration, and monumental architecture, all of which required coordination on a scale never before attempted, and the Sumerians credited this achievement not primarily to human ingenuity, but to divine instruction from the Anunnaki and other gods. The mainstream historical fact here is beautifully documented. Uruk, possibly the world's first true city, grows to a population of perhaps 40,000 to 80,000 people by 2900 BCE, surrounded by a wall that, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, was built by the hero king himself, stretching for 9 kilometers and including over 900 semicircular towers, an archaeological reality that was long thought to be pure myth until excavations in the 1920s and 1930s actually found the wall, proving once again that ancient texts often contain kernels of historical truth wrapped in legendary embellishment. The city's temple complex, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, called the Enna district, covers over 100,000 square meters and includes some of the earliest examples of monumental architecture, with pillars decorated in colored stone mosaics arranged in geometric patterns that must have dazzled visitors arriving from smaller settlements, creating a sense that this was indeed where heaven touched earth, where the divine met the mortal. Each major Sumerian city was understood to be under the particular protection of a specific deity: Enlil in Nippur, Enki in Eridu, Nana the moon god in Ur, Inanna in Uruk, and this deity was believed to literally own the city and its surrounding agricultural lands, with the human population understood as tenant farmers working divine property, which created an interesting theological justification for what was essentially a theocratic economy. The temple wasn't just a religious center, but the economic heart of the city, owning vast estates, employing hundreds of workers, storing grain and goods, making loans, and keeping meticulous records of all transactions, which is actually why writing was invented, not to record the great deeds of heroes or the wisdom of philosophers, but to track who owed the temple, how many sheep. Now the fringe interpretation of these cities takes a predictably dramatic turn, suggesting that the Anunnaki didn't just inspire urban development but actively designed and oversaw it, with each city serving as a kind of administrative center for their mining operations or genetic experiments or whatever alien agenda you prefer. And some theorists point to the sophisticated city planning, the straight streets, the sewage systems, the standardized brick sizes, as evidence of advanced technical knowledge that primitive humans couldn't possibly have figured out on their own, which frankly does a disservice to our ancestors who were exactly as intelligent as we are, just working with different tools and knowledge bases. According to these alternative interpretations, the ziggurats themselves weren't just temples, but landing platforms for spacecraft, or communication devices for contacting the home planet, or power generators tapping into Earth's electromagnetic fields, all of which require reading descriptions of mud brick architecture through a lens so distorted that a simple temple becomes a techno-magical device. Sitchin in particular claimed that the Anunnaki assigned different gods to oversee different cities as part of an elaborate administrative structure, with Enki overseeing the gold mining operations in Southeast Africa. Yes, you read that right, Southeast Africa, which is quite far from Sumer, and Enlil managing the operations in Mesopotamia proper, though evidence for this organizational chart is, shall we say, entirely absent from actual Sumerian texts, which describe something rather different. The scholarly debate about Sumerian urbanization is actually fascinating without needing to invoke aliens, focusing on questions like what combination of environmental factors, technological innovations, and social developments led to cities emerging in this particular place at this particular time. Some scholars emphasize the role of irrigation agriculture in the fertile but challenging environment between the Tigris and Euphrates, arguing that managing complex canal systems required new forms of social organization and centralized authority, essentially proposing that cities grew out of the need to coordinate water management. Others emphasize trade, noting that southern Mesopotamia lacked many basic resources like stone, timber, and metal, forcing communities to develop long-distance exchange networks that gradually required urban centers as hubs, or focusing on craft specialization and the efficiencies created when potters, weavers, metalworkers, and other specialists could concentrate in one location rather than every household producing everything it needed. Dr. Guillermo Algaz, of the University of California, San Diego, has argued for what he calls the Uruk expansion, suggesting that the cultural influence of Uruk spread throughout the Near East between 3,500 and 3,100 BCE, establishing colonies and trading outposts that created a kind of world system with Uruk at its center, a theory that remains controversial but highlights how early this civilization was reaching outward, connecting distant regions. The role of religion in all this is undeniable. The temples were the largest buildings, consumed the most resources, and employed the most people, suggesting that whatever else was driving urbanization, shared belief systems and ritual practices were absolutely central to making cities function. The Anunnaki, in this context, provided a cosmic framework that legitimized the entire social structure. The gods owned everything. The priests managed divine property on their behalf. The king ruled as the god's chosen representative, and everyone else worked to maintain this divinely ordained system, which sounds oppressive to modern ears, but apparently provided enough stability and security that people voluntarily chose city life over village life in sufficient numbers to make these urban centers viable for thousands of years. The temple precincts themselves were mini-cities within cities, surrounded by walls, containing workshops, granaries, administrative buildings, priestesses' residences, and of course the ziggurat at the center, that stepped pyramid reaching toward the sky with a shrine at its summit, where the god supposedly descended to earth, though whether anyone actually believed the god physically showed up, or understood this more metaphorically, is one of those questions that probably varied from person to person, even in ancient times. Archaeological evidence from excavated extensively by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, reveals a city of remarkable sophistication, two-story houses with interior courtyards, a complex street plan, evidence of extensive trade with the Indus Valley and Afghanistan, elaborate burial practices in the royal cemetery, including sacrificial retainers, who apparently went willingly to their deaths to serve their rulers in the afterlife, which tells us something about the power of religious belief to shape behavior in ways that seem alien to modern sensibilities. The famous standard of a wooden box decorated with shell and lapis lazuli, showing scenes of war and peace, depicts a world where social hierarchies are clearly established, with the king larger than other figures, receiving tribute, commanding armies, presiding over banquets, all under the apparent blessing of divine authority. But let's talk about daily life in these cities, because that's where religion met reality, in ways both profound and mundane. You're a barley farmer living just outside the city walls, working land nominally owned by the Temple of Enlil, which means a portion of your harvest goes to the temple as rent and taxes, another portion goes to your family's consumption, and maybe if you're lucky, you have some left over to trade for fish from the marshes, or dates from the palm groves, or wool from the shepherds in the hills. Your year is structured around religious festivals, the New Year's Akitu festival, when the gods' fates are determined for the coming year, various planting and harvest rituals, monthly celebrations on the day of the new moon, occasional special rites when the city faces crisis or celebration. You might go your entire life without seeing the inner sanctum of the ziggurat, where the priests perform the most sacred rituals, but you participate in public processions, leave offerings at neighborhood shrines, tell your children stories about Enlil and the other gods, invoke divine protection before every risky endeavor, and understand your prosperity or hardship as directly related to whether you and your community are maintaining proper relationships with the divine powers. The Anunnaki, in this lived context, are part of a vast heavenly bureaucracy. You probably couldn't name all 50 or 700 of them, but you know they exist, you know they judge souls after death, you know they can be petitioned through the proper rituals and offerings, and you know that keeping them happy is basically the point of everything the priests and king are constantly doing. The fringe theories tend to strip away this rich cultural context, reducing everything to simple cause and effect. Advanced aliens arrived, modified human genetics, taught agriculture and writing, built cities, then left, which is a much less interesting story than the actual historical process of humans gradually, over thousands of years, figuring out how to live in large groups, developing technologies and social structures through trial and error, creating meaning systems that help them make sense of their existence, and recording all of it in the world's first writing. The irrigation systems alone represent an engineering achievement that doesn't require alien intervention to explain, but does require acknowledging that ancient people were capable of sophisticated planning and execution. The canals around Uruk, some over 20 kilometers long, required calculating gradients, organizing labor, maintaining infrastructure, and mediating disputes over water allocation, all of which fostered the development of mathematics, surveying techniques, legal codes, and bureaucratic administration. One delightful historical detail: we have clay tablets recording the bureaucratic disputes between cities over water rights, including one from the city of Lagash complaining that the neighboring city of Umma had diverted their canal, reducing their water supply, which led to armed conflict, and eventually to one of the earliest recorded peace treaties, proving that some problems, like arguing with your neighbors over shared resources, are genuinely timeless. The role of the Anunnaki in these disputes is fascinating because both sides would claim divine support. Priests would perform divinations to determine which city had the god's favor, and military victories were interpreted as proof that your gods were stronger than the enemy's gods, creating a kind of theological competition that paralleled the political and military competition. The famous Stelo of Vultures, erected by King Eannatum of Lagash around 2450 BCE to commemorate his victory over Umma, shows the god Ningirsu holding a net full of enemy prisoners while vultures feast on their remains, which is certainly one way to document a border dispute. The cities themselves expand and contract over centuries, rising to prominence then declining as canals silt up, or political fortunes shift, or climate variations change, agricultural productivity. But the religious framework remains relatively constant, with the Anunnaki and other gods continuing to provide the explanatory structure for everything from military defeat to epidemic disease to personal misfortune. By around 2350 BCE, the Akkadian king Sargon conquers the Sumerian cities and creates the first empire in world history, uniting all of Mesopotamia under his rule. But notably, he doesn't overthrow the Sumerian religious system. Instead, he adopts it, installing his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of Nana in Ur, where she composes the earliest signed literary works in history, hymns to Inanna, that are both personal and political, establishing herself as a serious poet while legitimizing her father's conquest through religious authority. The continuity of the Anunnaki tradition through this political upheaval demonstrates how deeply embedded these beliefs were in Mesopotamian civilization. Conquerors might come and go, but the gods remained, and maintaining proper relationships with them remained essential to any ruler's legitimacy. The architectural evidence alone tells a story of sustained religious devotion. Temples are rebuilt on the same sacred spots for millennia, each generation constructing on top of the ruins of the previous one, gradually raising the temple platform higher and higher, an artificial mountain where earth meets heaven. The practical reasons for this building pattern probably include that it's easier to build on top of old ruins than to clear them away completely, and that sacred space once established tends to remain sacred. But the cumulative effect is structures that literally embed history within themselves, each layer representing a different generation's relationship with the divine. If you could slice through a ziggurat like a layer cake, you would see the story of the city, its prosperity and decline, its technological evolution, its artistic styles, all oriented around the unchanging principle that this spot, precisely here, is where the god dwells and must be honored. The Anunnaki themselves, in all their textual appearances, never quite coalesce into distinct personalities, the way the major gods do. They remain somewhat abstract, a collective presence that maintains cosmic order, judges human actions, and occasionally intervenes in mortal affairs, when the narrative requires divine counsel or heavenly judgment. This abstract quality is actually typical of pantheons in general. Not every divine being needs a full mythology and cult. Some serve functional roles in the theological system without requiring elaborate stories, and the Anunnaki seem to occupy this functional space, representing divine authority in the aggregate, rather than as individuals with petitions and preferences. The Sumerian king list presents modern historians with one of the most delightfully bizarre documents from the ancient world, beginning with the famous line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu," then proceeding to list rulers who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years before a great flood swept over the earth, and afterward kingship descended again from heaven, but with rulers whose reign lengths, while still improbably long, at least approach something vaguely mortal, and the whole thing reads like someone's attempt to create a comprehensive political history that bridges the divine and human realms, while possibly getting some of their numbers very, very wrong. The mainstream historical understanding of this document, which survives in multiple copies from different periods with variations that tell their own story about how texts evolved, is that it represents a legitimizing mythology for kingship itself by tracing royal authority back through an unbroken chain to the very beginning of time when the gods established monarchy on earth. Each successive ruler could claim a place in this cosmic order, making their rule not just politically convenient but cosmologically necessary. The document is actually quite sophisticated in its structure, dividing history into pre-flood and post-flood periods, listing kings city by city as political supremacy shifted from one urban center to another, and in the process creating one of humanity's first attempts at comprehensive chronological history, even if that history is deeply mythologized. The antediluvian kings, the ones before the flood, supposedly ruled for absurd lengths of time. Ululim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, followed by Alungar, who managed 36,000 years, and so on through 8 kings of 5 different cities, totaling 241,200 years before the flood, which even ancient readers might have found a bit excessive, suggesting these figures served a symbolic rather than literal chronological function, perhaps indicating that these kings ruled in a different time, when the boundaries between divine and mortal were more permeable, or perhaps simply emphasizing the ancient glory and legitimacy of each city's royal lineage. After the flood, the reign lengths become somewhat more reasonable. Gilgamesh of Uruk supposedly ruled for 126 years, which is still impressive, but at least within the realm of extreme longevity, rather than geological timescales. And as the king list progresses toward more historically verifiable periods around 2600 BCE and later, the reign lengths continue to decrease until they match what we might expect from actual human lifespans, creating this lovely narrative arc from mythical time to historical time. The fringe interpretation, naturally, seizes on these enormous pre-flood reign lengths as evidence that the antediluvian kings were either Anunnaki themselves or human Anunnaki hybrids who inherited alien longevity, with some enthusiasts calculating that Anunnaki years might be different from Earth years, perhaps corresponding to their home planet's orbital period, which Sitchin claimed was 3,600 Earth years, allowing for mathematical gymnastics that can make the numbers seem more plausible if you're willing to do enough creative arithmetic and ignore that no ancient text suggests any such conversion factor. This interpretation treats the king list as a straightforward historical document that just needs the right decoding to reveal its true meaning as a record of alien-human contact and governance, rather than understanding it as what it actually is, a political document that uses mythological frameworks to legitimize contemporary power structures by connecting them to divine origins. Some alternative theorists point to the flood itself as evidence of a catastrophic event possibly caused by the Anunnaki or by cosmic disaster they warned humanity about, noting that flood stories appear in many ancient cultures, which is true, but also explained by the fact that many ancient cultures developed along rivers that periodically flooded catastrophically, creating traumatic collective memories that entered mythology. The scholarly debate around the king list is actually quite rich, focusing on questions of composition date, political motivation, historical reliability, and relationship to other ancient Near Eastern king lists and chronographic traditions. Most scholars date the earliest compilation of the list to the Ur-3 period around 2100 BCE, though the tradition of tracking dynastic succession clearly goes back earlier, and the list was copied and updated well into the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, each new copy reflecting the political interests of whoever commissioned it. Some versions of the list include or exclude certain kings or cities depending on which center held political power when the copy was made, revealing that this wasn't a neutral historical record, but an actively political document used to assert claims about legitimate succession and rightful authority. Dr. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard, one of the great Sumerologists of the 20th century, analyzed the king list extensively and argued that despite its mythological framework, it preserves genuine historical information about the sequence of political dominance among Sumerian cities, suggesting we should neither dismiss it entirely as myth nor accept it uncritically as fact, but rather use it carefully alongside archaeological and other textual evidence to reconstruct what actually happened in early Mesopotamian political history. The connection to the Anunnaki comes through the concept that kingship itself was a divine gift. The me of kingship in Sumerian terms, a concept that's difficult to translate, but roughly means the cosmic principles or powers that structure reality, given by the gods to humanity, and several myths describe how kingship descended from heaven, often specifically from An or Enlil, suggesting that royal authority wasn't something humans invented, but something divinely instituted, with the Anunnaki as part of the divine council that made this decision. One particularly interesting text describes how Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit the god Enki and gets him drunk, yes really, and while he's intoxicated, he gives her numerous mess including kingship, priesthood, truth, and various crafts and technologies, which she promptly loads onto her boat and sails back to Uruk. And when Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he sends servants to retrieve the mess, but Inanna refuses, and Enki eventually accepts that Uruk now legitimately possesses these divine powers, which is honestly one of the more entertaining explanations for how a city acquired political and cultural prominence. The story works on multiple levels, as comedy, as political allegory, as theological statement about how divine power gets distributed, and it suggests that even in ancient Mesopotamia, people understood that claims about divine authority could be contested, and that legitimacy sometimes came down to who could tell the most convincing story about why their city deserved supremacy. The king list's pre-flood section names 5 cities that held kingship: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, only the last of which, Shuruppak, appears prominently in the flood narrative itself as the home city of Ziusudra or Utnapishtim in later Akkadian versions, the Mesopotamian Noah figure who receives divine warning to build an ark and preserve life through the deluge. Archaeological evidence suggests that catastrophic flooding did occur in Mesopotamia, with different cities showing flood layers at different periods, though not all at the same time, suggesting that while major floods were regular occurrences in the river valleys, the single universal flood of mythology represents a combination of various flood memories plus a powerful literary motif about divine judgment and renewal. The Anunnaki appear in the flood story as part of the divine council that decides to destroy humanity, with different gods having different motivations. Enlil wants to wipe out humans because they're too noisy and disturbing his rest, which seems like an overreaction, but fits with his character as a somewhat irritable authority figure, while Enki, who has more affection for his human creations, secretly warns Ziusudra, allowing humanity to survive. This division among the gods, with some wanting to destroy humanity and others working to save it, recurs throughout Mesopotamian literature and suggests a sophisticated theological understanding that divine will wasn't monolithic, that gods could disagree, and that humans existed in a precarious position between various divine interests and powers. After the flood, according to the king list, kingship descended from heaven once again, first to Kish, where the first post-Diluvian king, Gaur, ruled for 200 years, still quite long, but a dramatic reduction from the pre-flood reigns, and then successively to other cities, as political fortunes shifted, creating a pattern of rising and falling dynasties that would characterize Mesopotamian history for millennia. Some of these later kings are historically verifiable through contemporary inscriptions and archaeological evidence. We have actual royal inscriptions from kings like Enbaraji of Kish, around 2600 BCE, proving that the king list, as it approaches more recent periods, begins to overlap with confirmable historical record, which suggests it combines genuine tradition about dynastic succession with mythological framing about origins and legitimacy. The figure who bridges mythical and historical most famously is Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, listed in the king list as reigning for 126 years as the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, and also the hero of humanity's earliest surviving epic poem, a larger-than-life figure whose quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu takes him to the ends of the earth, where he meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who achieved immortality, and learns that death is humanity's fate, that immortality belongs to the gods alone, and that the best humans can hope for is to leave a lasting name through great deeds. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which survives in various versions from Sumerian, Akkadian, and other sources spanning nearly 2 millennia, mentions the Anunnaki several times, most notably in the flood narrative where they weep at the destruction they've allowed to be unleashed, regretting the decision to destroy humanity even as the deluge rages, which adds a note of divine pathos and suggests that even the gods can make mistakes or feel remorse about the consequences of their actions. The historical Gilgamesh probably did exist. We have references to him in texts that predate the epic's literary composition. But whether he was the philosophical hero king of the epic, or just a successful ruler, whose reputation grew in the telling, is impossible to determine. By the time he appears in literature, myth and history have become inseparable, which is true of most ancient figures whose lives predate contemporary documentation. The king list serves partly to establish that Uruk's claim to political supremacy was ancient and divinely sanctioned, tracing back through Gilgamesh to earlier rulers, and ultimately to the post-flood re-establishment of kingship from heaven itself, creating a chain of legitimacy that any contemporary ruler of Uruk could invoke when asserting authority over rival cities. This use of history as political legitimation is hardly unique to Sumer. Every civilization develops origin myths that justify present power structures, but the king list is one of humanity's earliest sophisticated attempts at this rhetorical move, and its influence can be traced through subsequent Near Eastern traditions, including biblical genealogies and king lists. The Anunnaki's role in all this is primarily to establish the cosmic framework. They are part of the divine council that institutes kingship. They judge worthy and unworthy rulers. They maintain the cosmic order that earthly monarchy is supposed to reflect, and their presence in the religious and literary tradition means that no Mesopotamian king could claim authority without at least implicitly acknowledging these divine powers and performing the rituals necessary to maintain proper relationships with them. Various texts describe how kings would perform elaborate ceremonies at the New Year festival, ritually dying and being reborn, renewing their divine mandate, sometimes ritually marrying the goddess Inanna, in a ceremony that was supposed to ensure fertility for the land in the coming year, which probably involved actual sexual activity with a priestess representing the goddess, making ancient theology considerably more hands-on than its modern descendants. The question of where kingship really came from, not theologically but historically, is one that scholars still debate. with various theories proposing that it emerged from military leadership during warfare, or from religious authority, as temple administrators gained political power, or from successful arbitration of disputes in growing communities that needed some form of centralized decision-making, or probably from some combination of all these factors varying from city to city and period to period. What's clear is that by the time we have written records, kingship is well established, thoroughly theologized, and understood as a necessary institution that connects heaven and earth, with the king serving as intermediary between divine will and human society, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual, just governance, military protection, and massive building projects that demonstrated the city's prosperity and divine favor. The ziggurats themselves served partly as monuments to royal piety and capability. Any king who could mobilize enough labor and resources to build or rebuild a temple on such a scale was clearly favored by the gods and capable of effective rule, making temple construction both religious duty and political statement. There's something almost hypnotic about contemplating the kingless structure, the way it bridges impossible timescales, connecting the cosmic origins of kingship to whatever contemporary ruler commissioned the latest copy, creating continuity across ruptures, establishing order in what was actually a chaotic succession of competing city-states and occasional empire builders, imposing narrative on events that probably felt much more contingent and uncertain to people living through them. Daily life under the supposed rule of the Anunnaki and their earthly representatives looks remarkably ordinary in most respects, which might be the most compelling argument against the extraterrestrial intervention hypothesis. If advanced aliens were actually running things, you'd expect more dramatic innovations than better irrigation techniques and standardized clay brick dimensions, though to be fair to the fringe theorists, they'd argue that the aliens delegated actual administration to humans and focused on their mining operations or genetic programs or whatever, which conveniently explains why there's no obvious evidence of technology beyond what humans of the period could achieve with enough ingenuity and organization. The mainstream archaeological evidence paints a picture of a society that's sophisticated but entirely human in scale. People live in mud brick houses clustered along narrow streets, keeping their valuable goods in locked rooms, raising small livestock in courtyard spaces, working primarily in agriculture and craft production, paying taxes to temple and king, participating in local religious festivals, marrying within approved social boundaries, raising children who will follow similar occupational paths, and generally living lives that would be recognizable in their basic structure to farming peoples throughout pre-industrial history. We have extensive administrative records from the Year 3 period, around 2100 to 2000 BCE, that give us remarkable detail about daily economic life, tablets recording rations distributed to workers, tracking sheep and goat herds down to individual animals, documenting textile production from wool processing through finished garments, recording beer production, because beer was a daily beverage and form of payment, sometimes constituting a significant portion of a worker's compensation, and generally showing us a complex managed economy where temple administrators tracked everything with obsessive detail. One delightful tablet records a worker's complaint that his beer ration was short, another documents a herd manager's excuse for why some sheep died. Wolves got them apparently, which might be true, or might be ancient Mesopotamia's version of the dog ate my homework. And these bureaucratic minutiae bring us closer to the lived reality of ancient Sumer than any theological text about the Anunnaki ever could. The fringe interpretation struggles with this mundane reality, occasionally trying to read advanced technology into ordinary objects, claiming that cylinder seals depicting gods show them wearing wristwatches or holding electronic devices, when actually they're wearing standard Mesopotamian jewelry and holding symbols of divine authority like was scepters and ankh symbols, or wait, those are Egyptian. Mesopotamian gods hold various implements depending on their identity and function, but definitely not iPhones. The famous helicopter hieroglyphs of Abydos in Egypt get similarly misinterpreted despite being an obvious case of later hieroglyphs carved over earlier ones, creating coincidental shapes that vaguely resemble modern aircraft if you squint and want to see them, and the same interpretive approach gets applied to Mesopotamian art with similar results. Ordinary ancient iconography reinterpreted through modern technological assumptions. Some alternative theorists point to mysterious ancient batteries, the so-called Baghdad batteries from Parthian period Iraq, which might have been used for electroplating gold onto silver objects, or might have been storage jars for sacred scrolls, the archaeological context being ambiguous, but regardless, they date to around 200 BCE, well after the Sumerian period we're discussing, and not exactly evidence of Anunnaki technological assistance. The scholarly discussion of daily life focuses on reconstructing social structure, economic systems, gender roles, family patterns, religious practice as it was actually lived rather than as it was formally prescribed, and the experience of ordinary people whose names appear in administrative records but who left no personal documents describing their thoughts and feelings. Gender roles in Sumerian society were clearly defined but perhaps more flexible than in some later Mesopotamian periods. Women could own property, engage in business, serve as priestesses, and even as scribes occasionally, though literacy was predominantly male and most high-status positions were reserved for men. The institution of the Natatu, women who were dedicated to a god and lived in cloistered communities, owned property and ran businesses but didn't marry or have children, creating a kind of third category between wife and unmarried daughter, providing one social option for women from wealthy families beyond marriage. Entedwana, whom we mentioned earlier, represents an exceptional case, high priestess, royal daughter, accomplished poet, but her very exceptionalism tells us that most women occupied more constrained roles, working in household production, craft specialization, or temple service, their contributions essential but largely unrecorded in the surviving texts. The Anunnaki, in texts describing daily ritual practice, receive offerings just like other gods: bread, beer, meat from sacrificed animals, fruits, beer. Did we mention beer because it shows up constantly in offering lists and ration documents, and the mechanics of how this supposedly worked involve priests accepting these offerings on behalf of the gods, consuming or redistributing them, and maintaining the fiction or reality, depending on your theological perspective, that the gods were actually partaking of these meals, and in return providing divine favor. Major festivals involved processions where the god's statue, housed normally in the inner sanctum of the temple, would be carried through the city streets on a portable platform, allowing ordinary people to see the divine image and participate in celebrations, creating moments of collective religious experience that reinforced community identity and divine connection. The Akitu, or New Year festival, celebrated in spring, involved elaborate rituals, including the ritual humiliation of the king, who had to surrender his royal insignia to the high priest, declare that he had not sinned or neglected his duties, then receive ritual slaps before being restored to his throne, symbolically dying and being reborn for the new year, which must have been quite a thing to witness, and certainly kept kings aware that their authority came with accountability, at least in ritual terms, if not always in practice. Archaeological evidence from residential areas shows us houses of varying sizes, indicating social stratification: larger houses, with multiple rooms arranged around a courtyard; smaller houses, with just a few rooms; evidence of craft production in some households with kilns for pottery or weights for textile work, storage areas for grain and other goods, and shared community spaces like wells and small shrines. One excavated neighborhood in Ur shows houses built so close together that neighbors shared walls, creating privacy challenges that building codes tried to address with rules about door placement and window heights, proving that urban living difficulties are truly ancient, and that people have always struggled with balancing density with quality of life. The streets themselves were unpaved, turning into mud during rains, dusty during dry periods, lined with waste that gradually accumulated, until someone organized a cleanup or it just compressed into new street level, raising the street surface over decades and centuries, which is one reason why archaeological sites show multiple building levels with later structures built on top of earlier ones. Water management was crucial. Canals brought water from the rivers for irrigation and drinking. Drainage ditches carried away excess water and sewage, and maintaining these systems required constant labor and coordination, organized through the temple administrations and royal authority. Another example of how religious institutions served practical functions that had little to do with theology and everything to do with making urban life viable. The Anunnaki's connection to all this is primarily through the theological framework that justified the entire system. The land belonged to the gods, humans were their servants, working divine property, and maintaining proper relationship with divine powers through ritual and offering ensured that the canals flowed, the crops grew, the city prospered, and chaos was kept at bay. Illness and misfortune were often interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, requiring divination to determine what offense had been committed and what ritual remedy was needed, creating a system where religious specialists, priests, diviners, exorcists, physicians who combined practical medicine with ritual healing played essential roles in daily life. We have extensive medical and magical texts describing treatments for various ailments, combining practical remedies like herbal preparations and bandaging with ritual components like incantations and offerings to specific gods, reflecting a worldview that didn't distinguish sharply between natural and supernatural causation the way modern medicine does. One text describes treatment for headache involving both a plant-based poultice and a ritual invocation to the god Ea, suggesting the Mesopotamian approach was more try everything that might work, rather than choosing between practical and spiritual remedies. The fringe theorists sometimes point to ancient medical knowledge as evidence of alien instruction, but actually Mesopotamian medicine, while sophisticated in some respects, was also limited by lack of understanding of infection, anatomy, and physiology that would only come much later, making it recognizably ancient rather than impossibly advanced. The legal system, documented extensively in collections like the Code of Hammurabi from 1754 BCE, which built on earlier Sumerian legal traditions, shows us a society concerned with social order, property rights, commercial disputes, family law, and maintaining hierarchical distinctions, with punishments varying based on the social status of victim and perpetrator, which we might find unjust, but which reflects the stratified nature of the society. The gods, including the Anunnaki as divine judges, were understood to uphold cosmic justice, and human law was seen as reflecting divine order, so kings who issued law codes were serving a religious function, bringing earthly law into alignment with heavenly principles. Contracts were recorded on clay tablets, sometimes sealed inside clay envelopes to prevent tampering, with witness testimony and oath-taking before gods invoked to ensure honesty, creating a legal system that combined practical enforcement with religious sanction. One remarkable aspect of Mesopotamian civilization that doesn't fit neatly into the alien intervention narrative is the sheer continuity and conservatism of the culture. Scribes in the 2nd millennium BCE were still learning Sumerian as a classical language and copying texts composed 1,000 years earlier. Temple rituals maintained the same basic forms for centuries. Artistic conventions remained stable for millennia, all of which suggests a society deeply invested in tradition and continuity, rather than one experiencing technological or cultural revolutions you might expect from active alien management. The craft specialization we see in the archaeological record, highly skilled artisans producing standardized pottery, metalwork of increasing sophistication, cylinder seals carved with incredible detail, textile production at industrial scale, all represents steady improvement in human technical capability, the kind of gradual advancement through accumulated knowledge and refined technique that characterizes human development everywhere, not sudden knowledge transfers from advanced aliens. The mathematics developed for administrative purposes, tracking rations, measuring fields, calculating taxes, used a base 60 number system that still influences our division of time into 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes, and while it's an elegant system well suited for calculation because 60 has many divisors, it's not evidence of cosmic knowledge, but rather a practical solution arrived at by people who needed to divide things flexibly. Educational texts show students learning multiplication tables, memorizing standard legal and religious formulae, practicing writing the same cuneiform signs over and over until they achieved the speed and accuracy required of professional scribes, all very human forms of knowledge transmission requiring patience, practice, and the kind of unglamorous repetition that nobody would include in a story about alien tutors bestowing wisdom on humanity. The Anunnaki themselves, when they appear in literary texts beyond administrative or religious formulas, are often surprisingly anthropomorphic in their concerns and behaviors. They get drunk, they scheme against each other, they form alliances, they worry about their status and honor, they make mistakes, all of which suggests that Mesopotamians conceived of divine beings as essentially like humans but more powerful and immortal, following a pattern common in polytheistic systems where gods reflect and magnify human qualities rather than being utterly alien others. This anthropomorphism actually makes these deities more accessible and understandable to worshippers. You can negotiate with a god who has understandable motivations and emotions. You can try to figure out what they want and how to please them, whereas an incomprehensible cosmic force or extraterrestrial scientist with utterly alien psychology would be much harder to relate to or incorporate into daily religious practice. The economic texts give us glimpses of humor and personality, even in bureaucratic contexts. One tablet records an argument between two officials over who was responsible for a missing donkey, complete with sarcastic remarks that remain funny across 4,000 years. Another shows a schoolboy's excuse for why he was late, that blames basically everyone else, including his mother for not waking him, and his teacher for being unreasonable, suggesting that human nature hasn't changed much, and that ancient Mesopotamians would recognize our own excuses and evasions as entirely familiar. As we drift toward sleep, let's reflect on what these ancient stories really mean for us now. How the Anunnaki have traveled through 4,000 years from Sumerian clay tablets to modern internet forums, transforming along the way from religious tradition to archaeological puzzle to fringe theory phenomenon, and what this transformation tells us about how humans make meaning from the past. The mainstream historical view, which has the advantage of being based on what the texts actually say when translated by people who actually read cuneiform, suggests that the Anunnaki were divine beings in a complex polytheistic system, that Sumerian civilization developed through entirely human processes over thousands of years, that the sophistication of their achievements reflects human intelligence and capability, rather than alien intervention, and that reading these texts through a modern technological lens fundamentally misunderstands how ancient peoples thought about cosmology, divinity, and their place in the universe. But there's something compelling about the alternative narrative too, isn't there? Even if it's not historically accurate, the idea that we're not alone, that mysterious beings visited Earth in deep antiquity, that ancient monuments and texts contain encoded messages waiting for us to decipher them, that human history is part of a much larger cosmic story. These ideas speak to contemporary yearnings for meaning and connection to something beyond our ordinary existence, which is probably why ancient astronaut theories remain popular despite being thoroughly debunked by actual experts. What both perspectives share is a deep fascination with origins, with how civilization began, with what the earliest humans thought about their world and their gods, and that fascination is entirely healthy and human. We want to know where we came from, how we got here, what the very first people who built cities and wrote down their thoughts believed and experienced. The Sumerian achievement is remarkable enough without needing extraterrestrial explanation. They invented writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, sophisticated art and literature, organized religion, bureaucratic administration, and created cities that lasted thousands of years, all while believing they were serving gods who had given them these gifts. And whether those gods were understood as beings who literally existed, or as powerful metaphors for natural and social forces, probably varied from person to person. Even then, the texts themselves, those clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, survive as humanity's earliest direct voices, allowing us to read the actual words of people who lived 50 centuries ago, their hopes and fears, their religious devotions, their mundane commercial transactions, their epic poetry, all preserved in fired clay that has outlasted every other material artifact from their civilization, except stone. There's something deeply moving about holding a tablet, even a replica, and seeing those tiny precise marks, knowing that someone sat in the morning light of a Mesopotamian dawn, carefully forming each sign before the clay dried, recording information they deemed important enough to preserve, never imagining that their words would be read by people in an unimaginably distant future, translated into languages that didn't exist yet, studied by scholars using methods and technologies they couldn't have conceived. The continuity of human curiosity across those 50 centuries. Their questions were our questions. Their attempts to understand existence and meaning parallel our own. Their stories still resonate because fundamental human experiences haven't changed, even as everything else has. Perhaps that's the real message we should take from the Anunnaki stories. Not that aliens visited Earth, but that humans have always wondered about our origins, always created stories to explain our place in the cosmos, always sought meaning in the face of mystery. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine yourself not as a modern person burdened with all our contemporary anxieties, but as a Sumerian farmer watching the sun set over the marshes, the ziggurat of your city rising against the darkening sky, knowing that inside the priests are performing the evening rituals that keep the world in order, feeling connected to something larger than yourself, part of a cosmic system that makes sense even if you don't understand all its details, secure in the knowledge that the gods are there, that the seasons will turn, that tomorrow you'll wake and work and live within a framework of meaning that has endured for generations and will endure for generations more. Whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or mythological constructs matters less, perhaps, than what they represented. An attempt to understand power, authority, legitimacy, the relationship between heaven and earth, the origin of social order, the meaning of human existence, and in that attempt, the ancient Sumerians were doing exactly what we still do, just with different vocabularies and technologies. So let their stories drift through your mind as you drift towards sleep, not worrying about whether they're literally true or not, just appreciating them as humanity's earliest surviving attempt to explain everything. to create meaning from experience, to connect the mundane and the cosmic, the human and the divine. If you've enjoyed this journey back to ancient Mesopotamia and found yourself relaxing into sleep, I'd appreciate if you'd subscribe to the channel, but only if it feels right to you. Only if you genuinely want more of these late-night historical explorations, where we take ancient topics seriously, while acknowledging their strangeness to modern ears. Let the images of clay tablets and temple ziggurats, of irrigation canals reflecting starlight, of priests chanting in languages no one speaks anymore, of gods whose names have survived their civilizations, all blend together into the pleasant mental fog that precedes actual sleep, knowing that history is there whenever you want to return to it, deep and strange and endlessly fascinating, full of people who lived real lives in worlds utterly different from ours, yet recognizable in their fundamental humanity. The Anunnaki fade now, back into the clay tablets where they've rested for millennia, neither gods nor aliens but marks on clay that somehow bridge impossible distances of time and understanding, connecting us to the very first civilizations that looked at the stars and wondered what was out there, that built cities and wrote stories and tried to make sense of existence, just as we still do. End of script. Sweet dreams.